Chick-fil-A, right? So, is everybody having fun? Yeah. Have you learned something new today? Did you meet a new friend today? Excellent. That's what I like to hear. So our next presenter is Mr. Adam Duby. He's going to have a couple of really cool giveaways, so make sure you pay attention to his talk. He may give you some trivia questions that's really going to make you listen to his talk and do the right thing and answer those questions to get cool gifts. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Adam Duby.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks for the warm reception. So this talk is going to be about moving target defense. And I'm going to focus the talk, because it's a short one, we get about 25 minutes, on applications in software and binary diversifications in order to evade threats. A little bit about me. I'm instructor and course manager for Norwich University's online Bachelor of Science in Cybersecurity. I also have a lot of research interests focused around moving target defensive operations. But at the end of the day, I'm just some guy. So I'm going to try and formalize a case for moving target defense, what it is, and the motivation behind it. I'll talk about endpoints, tactics, briefly cover strategy, and the resistance in the community to moving target defense. I have to cover some brief definitions before I go into my formal proofs here. So attack patterns, I define them into two types of attacks, right? We have opportunistic attacks that are scalable. You cast a wide net against a wide range of victim set. The probability that each individual victim is compromised is low, but the aggregate sum is relatively high. Then there's targeted attacks that require some sort of intimate knowledge of the target. This often incurs a higher cost. So let me formalize a threat agent. There's a lot of threat models out there, but across all the threat models, I've seen two common things: that a threat is funded and resourced and is sufficiently motivated to conduct an attack to begin with. Therefore, we can summarize a threat as a function of a capability and intent. And it's the sufficiently motivated piece that drives moving target defense as a defensive strategy. So attacks are motivated by some sort of gain. There's a profit, there's something to be gained by launching the attack. Attack also incurs a cost. I'll say C sub n is the cost for each attack n. In general, right, the gain has to be greater than the cost of the attack. Otherwise, what's the point? That's basic economics. However, when we talk about attack persistence, how many times are you going to repeatedly be attacked to achieve that same gain? You can look at what I'm calling the persistence variable P. So the number of attacks will continue P will continue to increase as long as this inequality holds true. And then there's also the security design principle called adequate protection, which essentially states that your cost of your defense, in terms of manpower, maintenance, initialization, has to be proportional to the cost of the asset it's defending, and proportional to the operational impact if it's compromised. It makes sense, right? I'm not going to spend $2,000 defending something that is $500 in value. Therefore, we have what appears to be some sort of hopeless defense for the blue team. Because of the principle of adequate protection, I cannot defend against everything. Furthermore, it's impossible to enumerate all potential attacks, and I can't say with any sense of confidence that all the software on my system is free of vulnerabilities that can be exploited. Again, the attacks are relatively cheap because they're scalable, whereas our defenses are not scalable. And this gives rise to what's asymmetric cyber warfare. So why do vulnerable assets escape exploitation and compromise to begin with? Out there are assets that exist. They are vulnerable, but they manage to evade compromise. Why is that? Either their existence is unknown, nobody cares about it, or it's just simply not targeted. Why are assets not targeted? It's because the gain is negligible, or the gain is less than the cost of the attack to begin with. So therefore, moving target defense thrives at increasing the cost of the attack as opposed to mitigating all your vulnerabilities. Because we're realizing and we have to accept the fact that vulnerabilities are inevitable. Therefore, let's make the attack a little bit more complex and more challenging for each system. So moving target defense paradigm is motivated by this asymmetric costs that are born to the cyber defenders in an effort to trying to defend everything against attack patterns that are impossible to enumerate. And we do this by trying to increase the complexity of the cost of the attacks, reducing the exposure of the vulnerabilities. The vulnerabilities are there, but how long are they there for? So then we get into diversification as a security. Furthermore, we can reduce the duration of persistent threat activity by diversifying our systems. Even if they do compromise this system, how long can they stay in there before your system is diversified and the persistence is then they're kicked out? Further, reduce the scalability of opportunistic attacks. So again, we have this monoculture in defensive cyberspace where we configure our systems and we don't touch them and we leave them alone. Therefore, attacks are scalable across a vast array of victim sets. We want to reduce the scalability that drives cost of attack way up. Further, let's render threat intelligence unreliable. They conduct reconnaissance, scanning, enumeration activities, reverse engineering of your software. Then they go and weaponize, build their exploit, develop their attack plan before they deploy it. So let's ask ourselves, if I were to enumerate, if we were to go back to our systems that we're charged with defending and enumerate it and scan it, is it going to be the same weeks, months, or even years from now? How long is that intelligence valuable for? So there's different ways to manage our attack surface through attack surface reduction, right? The less stuff we have, the less we have to defend. But we're all digital hoarders. No one wants to do that. Then there's this concept of attack surface expansion, which is an artificial logical boundary expansion of your network that you're trying to defend. Make yourself look bigger than you really are. We had to talk about honey nets and decoys earlier this morning that kind of play into that. Then there's attack surface manipulation through diversification. That's where an attack surface expands and contracts at random intervals. So any type of scanning, enumeration, or intelligence collection efforts are therefore unreliable for any significant duration of time. Again, short talk, so I'm going to focus some of the case studies on software-specific applications. And diversification all started with address space layout randomization, motivated by buffer overflows. And this randomizes various memory locations, global offset tables. And this, combined with data execution prevention and various stack protection mechanisms, such as canaries, was fairly reliable. But then we started seeing an increase in return-oriented programming attacks, process injection, DLL hijacking, linking search order hijacking. So this level of randomization was not enough. And how does a return-oriented or ROP chain work? It finds gadgets in existing code. A gadget is a piece of code that's already been loaded into memory, and it pieces together all the gadgets to do something useful. I can't bring my weapon into the building, but if I can find all the parts to make the weapon within the building, then I'm good, right? So at the end of the day, the attacker still needs to know something about the target. It needs to know where those gadgets are. And if it can find one by correctly guessing the offset, then it can find multiples. Then came this idea of instruction set randomization. Right? If you want to inject code into a target, you have to know the target's instruction set. Right? You can't inject x86 assembly code or machine code into an ARM system, etc. So the concept of instruction set randomization diversifies the instructions and decrypts them when the instruction register fetches these instructions from data. However, this is still vulnerable to precompiled libraries because they're already compiled on the system. And then you're vulnerable to correlation attacks and so forth. Not to mention, this requires hardware support and it's expensive. So kernel interface diversification then became a new topic of research. Let's randomize system call interfaces. Let's do some excessive function name mangling and then resolve them at runtime to try and defeat DLL injection or DLL hijacking. Library search order diversification. And then there's this tool called RANDSys. RANDSys was a theoretical tool developed in conjunction with a research project from George Mason, Microsoft, and Purdue. The problem is that it is extremely expensive to run. There's an incredible performance overhead incurred. And also, it was still vulnerable to some ROP attacks because it didn't diversify the actual executable itself. So we have to add binary executable format code section randomization to try and defeat those building of ROP chains. Now let's talk about a little bit of the research area I'm mostly interested in, that's compiler-generated diversity. where every time I compile a piece of software from source code to target code, every time I compile it, it gives me a different version. Some sort of random number generator injected into the optimization scheme of the compiler can give me a different version of the software every time. Well, it doesn't work for scripted languages, right? We have to now look at injecting the randomness at a higher level in the compiler chain. So we look at lexical analysis randomization. And this can be done by extending the grammar to include some sort of random tag at the end of keywords. So therefore, if someone launches a script or code onto the target system, it won't be parsed correctly. It probably invokes some sort of exception error because the lexical analyzer won't produce the correct tokens. Again, the intent is to produce a unique instance of the software every time. Now, what about data structure layout randomization? This is the concept of diversifying our data structures. And again, it can be done by extending the grammar of high-level languages. But more importantly, we don't always want to trust our compiler to completely randomize our stuff for us, because if you think about public-facing APIs or network protocols, those stuff, they have to be static in order for other systems to communicate with them, hence application programming interface. So now we put the control in the hands of the programmer. So here's a struct, and that can the intent is to randomize the location in memory of these values. All right, because code injection requires the knowledge of the location of a function pointer relative to the return address on a stack. Right, and if you can diversify that every time, you can effectively try to defeat those types of attacks. So another example of DSLR, suppose I have some function, I called it besides Augusta. I know how it's going to look like when it's compiled into assembly code, and here I'm using Sedecal calling convention just as an example. I know that all my parameters are going to be pushed onto the stack from right to left. So now I want to see how I can diversify that. So DSLR-enabled compilers try to mix those up, add some padding in there, add garbage variables. So that way you don't know the absolute offset relative to the base frame. Now with all this diversification going on, we have the potential for an entropy problem. Right? Diversification has to be non-deterministic. If you can determine the outcome of your diversification routines, then what's the point? And true randomness is not free. It requires resources. You have to get system resources, whether it's average disk access time, core temperatures, something like that, to build your entropy pool inside of the operating system. However, static systems that you configure once and you leave it alone, you never touch it again, it has trouble building entropy. A few years back, this was known as the boot time entropy hole in Linux systems, where we're able to, a simple for loop can drain out dev random, which is my entropy pool, and I started getting blocking just after a few queries from the entropy pool. It couldn't produce any more entropy. I don't think the entropy problem, personally, is going to be that big of a deal, because rule of thumb, right, we only need about 256 bits of entropy to be considered effective in cryptography. So, and furthermore, we can try and scale our diversification techniques to limit that. So I envision a scalable binary diversification scheme where everyone wants to use the same software, however, everyone gets a different instance of the software. It's been diversified and randomized. Therefore, if you develop an exploit against client 1's version of the software, that attack is no longer scalable against the other clients. Now you're driving the cost of the attack way up. So there's also work out there for theoretical frameworks for moving target as a strategy, as a defensive strategy on enterprise networks. I think, personally, that we're a long way from achieving anything like this, but with the proliferation of virtualized systems and software-defined networking, I don't think it's unreasonable. So imagine your thin clients, every time you spin them up, you get a different instance of a virtualized machine. It's completely different. Operating system configuration changes. Your source code's been recompiled to be diverse. So these are called multivariant systems. And if you're sold on the idea of threat intelligence as a defense, then you can leverage an Intel feed And you want to make sure that the diversified system is orthogonal to the attack vector. If it's not, then it's not effective. Therefore, and if you can achieve that, you've effectively created a defensive maneuver on your system. There's a lot of resistance to moving target as a defensive strategy out there. When I talk to network owners, maintainers, and I present them with ideas like this, they look at me like I'm crazy, and they say, absolutely not. I need to know the state of my system at a given point in time. And that's a change management nightmare. Well, nobody really does change management anyway, so I don't really buy that as an excuse. But there are other good excuses, right? Application whitelisting by hash, that's done quite frequently. And if you're doing runtime software transformations, this won't be effective anymore. Writable code sections for runtime software transformation. I think we can all agree that writable code sections might be a bad idea. We did that decades ago. We don't want to go back to that. Also, runtime software integrity checks and performance and overhead. But it's really this psychological acceptability of diversifying our systems that's the biggest hinder to progress in the MTD research community. I need to know, my system needs to be static. I need to know what it looks like at any given point in time because I need to find anomalies. Well, if anomaly detection is your only defense, you're telling me that your defense is looking for adversary activity after it's already been launched. Whereas deterrence should be our primary line of effort from a defensive standpoint. So diversification aims to try to shift that asymmetric advantage in favor of the defenders. Attackers have been doing it for years. They diversify their malware, and then we're sold on using the idea of an MD5 hash to find the malware, but it's diversified every time. Why don't we diversify our systems? Make them a little bit harder to attack. Make the intelligence unreliable. So that's where the discussion comes in. Right? It's a lot harder to hit a moving target. And why do us as defenders, why do we think that moving target defense might be a bad idea, might be a good idea? And I'm interested in feedback from the audience at this point. Can you imagine diversifying your look at that thing go. Can you imagine diversifying your cyberspace terrain in an unpredictable manner that you might not have full control over? Or furthermore, could you imagine your software constantly changing and you don't know what it's changing to? The diversification itself may introduce new vulnerabilities. However, if you continually change over time, those vulnerabilities won't be persistent and their exposure is reduced. Yes, please. A great adversary tactic. Yeah, I remember the Conficker problem where the domain kept changing constantly. We can never figure out what the next domain was going to be. So adversaries or use diversification or moving target offense, I guess we can call it, in the past. Maybe compromise the diversification engine itself and take control of that. Yeah, so you may introduce, if you're going to do it in a scalable fashion, then you may introduce a single point of failure. Maybe then it's worthy to look at peer-to-peer systems for diversification. But no, that's a great point to bring up. Yes, please.
It's a great concept if you're talking about applying something technique-wise to your perimeter, to your defensive measures, but to your actual core, that thing you're trying to defend, you've got to know it's defended. And there's just no way to know it's defended, as you pointed out. I know it's about deterrence, but I've got to know that I'm actually going to have my deterrence, which is really good.
Yes, please. I see.
balance is, how is this, could this potentially adversely affect your ability to remediate? So as, if something has changed, we have to first see where the diversification mechanism has taken your systems, get to find that out, and then get to troubleshooting your incident. I think it could potentially add an additional layer of steps to get into solving the problem.
Agreed. I mean, if the diversification creates a second or third order effect on the operational requirements of the system itself, yeah, that could invoke some troubleshooting nightmares. I agree. Yes.
So
please.
The idea more to every time I go download, LibreOffice or something, it would automatically recompile it when I'm downloading it. I get a unique version and somebody else downloads it.
Correct.
Or is it more built into the operating system that we manage it so that the things always can be changed?
Correct.
Both?
Why not?
Okay, so you're saying, one is easier to get to.
One is easier to do, right? Because once you download it, you recompile it, you have your unique instance, but then you're still vulnerable to a targeted attack. Someone manages to get into your system, they extract your unique instance of that software, they can still reverse engineer it somehow. But if it's constantly changing, you've effectively increased the deterrence. Yes, please.
Well, I'm going to support you on this. Your main argument is that it's economics, and we all have to face this. I mean, we're not going to shadow IT applies to security. It's too expensive. It's not going to be done. So I think there's a lot of validity to this. That we've got to find a way to do it cheaper, and if this can be accomplished cheaper, we'll have jobs.
Cheaper and reliable, scalable, and effective. Yeah, there's not a lot of research out there on the effectiveness on this type of stuff. How much time do I got? 5 minutes. Okay. Yes, Mr. Bounce, please.
So is anybody actually doing any of this in the real world right now, or is this a theoretical idea? I mean, is it actually being done? Research right now, or what?
Right now, it's just mostly academic research, but it is being done in the real world by the red team, but not in blue space terribly often. Sometimes we obfuscate our code for IP protection and stuff like that, but not for the intent of diversifying the attack surface that I know of. Yes, please.
So I think it's a great example from it's very, very fast moving all over in software. Changes very frequently, and it's very hard to attack. It's not possible to attack. It's not maybe to the level that you're discussing, but definitely, it's got many of these kinds of features. You can't necessarily launch successful attacks against the software because they'll stop working very quickly and everybody needs something.
It's a great point. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, so the attack might work once, but it's not going to work for so long. Yes, please. Agreed. Yeah, trusting the compiler. That's the trusting trust security debate that's been going on for years. Where does the compiler lay in terms of the architecture? Who's in control of that compiler? Yeah, these are all good points. Yes, please, in the back.
Similar to the previous comment, in the event that this technology that's being developed remains primarily still an academic, does that mean it's in the private sector? And if so, how is that going to fit into the current concerns regarding encryption and the government having a backdoor in order to access it? Because at least with the current state of technology, this sounds like it would be essentially an unbreakable sort of code. If it falls into the wrong hands, is the government going to need to have a key role in its development in order to have a private control over it to safeguard its own systems? Or would this be something for the general public?
I mean, research and development always comes best from the open source community. And actually, just 10 days ago, IBM published their initial research results on ROP chain deterrence using a moving target platform by diversifying at random intervals their portable executable format. So IBM's working on this. But I think we're out of time. I got some gifts to give away. Real quick, someone tell me one example of software transformation that I discussed.
Yeah, exactly. Compiler generated diversity. And this next one is for, it's a local thing, so only for some local. Can someone talk about network diversification?